Tonight we'll be chatting with Sharon Hart Green, writer, translator, and professor of Hebrew and Yiddish literature at the University of Toronto. Sharon's debut novel, Come Back For Me, a gripping story of trauma, loss, and the redemptive power of love, set in the aftermath of World War II, was chosen as an editor's choice book by the Historical Novel Society and was shortlisted for the Goethe Award for Historical Fiction. I'd like to ask our viewers who have any questions to please type them into the chat box on your screen, and I will include as many as I can. Welcome, Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Your book is so beautifully written and is such a treat to read about Toronto in a novel. There are so many stories like this in our community of survivors and their families. Every story weaves together many of the same elements that appear in your book, and that's why it resonates so much and rings true. Tell us about your background. Were you born in Toronto?
Well, first of all, great to be here and nice to see all the faces in front of me. And thank you, Randy, for inviting me. Yes, I was born and raised in Toronto. I've lived most of my life here, although I did spend 7 years in Boston because I was a student there. I completed my undergraduate degree at Brandeis University. And then I went on and did my master's and PhD at Brandeis too. So I lived there for almost 7 years and then came back to came back to Toronto. So I am from here.
Right. Yes. And what about your parents and your grandparents? Where are they from?
Okay. Everyone assumes that my parents and grandparents are probably Hungarian because the novel focuses on Hungarian Jews, but actually they're not. My father was born in Canada, although his parents are Polish Jews. And my mother was born in Belarus, which at the time was governed by Poland. But she came when she was very young. She was only 3 years old. So she was raised in Canada. So my parents were very Canadianized. And my grandparents, as I said, one side from Poland, the other from Belarus.
Right. Have you ever visited the area where your mom is from?
No, I actually have not. Some of my kids have. I think 2 of my kids have been on March of the Living, but I actually have not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And tell us where you went to school.
Okay, well,
Before
Brandeis. I grew up at Eglinton and Avenue Road, so that must be familiar, I'm sure, to a lot of people in Toronto. And I went to Allenby Public School and North Toronto Collegiate. And then I went to U of T, but I didn't stay at U of T. I transferred to Brandeis as a junior. So I was at U of T for 2 years and then completed my undergraduate degree at Brandeis and then just kept going. So that's my educational background.
Okay. Tell us, was your family traditional?
Quasi. My mother came from a very traditional home. My grandparents were Orthodox Jews on my mother's side. So my mother followed in their footsteps to some extent. It was a Yiddish speaking home because, my mother's environment was a Yiddish speaking home. She was the youngest of 8 children. So when they came to Canada from Belarus, her older sisters and brothers didn't have much of a chance to have an English education. They were too old to go to school. Most of them ended up working in factories on Spadina Avenue. My mother was lucky. She was young enough that she was able to go to school. So my mother's family was very traditional, and she carried that on to some extent. My father came from a very secular background in Toronto. He didn't even have a bar mitzvah. His parents were very secular. And he went along with it for my mother's sake a little bit, but I became more traditional as I started exploring Judaism and ended up embracing traditional Jewish life, which was actually more, I think, of a surprise to a lot of people who didn't associate my family with particularly religious practices.
Right. So you learned Yiddish in your home. Is that
To some
correct?
extent, my mother used to speak, she spoke with all of her brothers and sisters and parents in Yiddish all the time. So she brought Yiddish into the home. So I understood it. I didn't speak it fluently. But when I went to Brandeis, I made a point of taking some Yiddish courses and then studying Yiddish literature. I was more interested in Hebrew literature, but the professor that I was studying with believed that in order to properly understand modern Hebrew literature, one had to also understand modern Yiddish literature because the two
Mm,
are really interconnected. Some of the first Hebrew writers were also writers who wrote in Yiddish, that they were
mm,
bilingual writers. So when I first started studying the literature, I felt, and with my advisor's encouragement, I felt that I really had to master both languages. I had to master both literatures. So when my husband and I moved back to Toronto after being at Brandeis, I ended up teaching Yiddish literature at U of T before I taught Hebrew literature because that's what they happened to need. They were looking for someone to teach Yiddish literature. I applied, I got the job, and it was probably 10 years until I ended up teaching Hebrew literature at U of T. And it's
wow.
funny because my dissertation, my PhD was really in Hebrew literature. So that
Mm.
was more of my specialty, but I've taught both.
So how did you learn Hebrew? Did you learn that later on
It was a
or?
struggle. I mean, I went to Israel a number of times. I studied it at U of T when I was there right from the beginning. And then when I transferred to Brandeis, I studied it and I just applied myself. And I mean, to this day, I try as much as I can to keep up with Israeli friends. For a while, I had this little one-on-one group study with one of the Shlichim families in Toronto, and we would speak Hebrew together every week, and then the next week we'd speak English together, so it helped them and it helped me. So I did this for many years, so I've tried as much as I can to speak Hebrew and to keep it up. And one of my kids lives in Israel now, so
Right. Wow. That's great.
yeah.
Okay. So do you still write short stories and poems?
Um, Occasionally, I mean, really, I've concentrated more on novel writing. After publishing the first novel, I decided that I really wanted to continue along that line. So I'm, about 2/3, 3/4 finished my next novel.
Wow.
So when I'm involved in writing a novel, I really try not to distract myself with other projects. So,
Right.
I mean, I've written the odd book review or, other short articles, but really I'm trying to get the novel done. And so I have to
Right.
really pour myself into it.
I see. Okay. My next question is there something unique about reading Yiddish and Hebrew literature in its original language? Or do you find that translations can fully capture the essence of the story or the poem or whatever
Yeah,
piece of
that's
literature?
a very good question because it really depends on the writer. What I have found is that there are certain writers who translate really well into English. And so when you're reading the English translation, you're really not missing very much. Whereas there are other writers that it's almost impossible to translate. And you're missing so much, or it just doesn't come out well in English. For example, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, the great Hebrew writer, I wrote my dissertation on one of his novels. Most of his novels do not translate well into English. His short stories do, but his novels don't. I would say the only novel that really translates well into English is called A Simple Story. That's a shorter novel, but his long novels, they're so difficult to translate and they just don't come across well in English. But yet you have a writer like Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Yiddish writer, he translates beautifully into English. So, it really depends on the writer and also the skill of the translator. I mean, there are some translators that are better than others.
Right.
Poetry is a whole different story. Again, there are some poets that translate well, like Yehuda Amichai. His work translates very well into English, and he's had excellent translators.
Hmm.
Whereas when I was teaching Hebrew poetry, I often would end up retranslating some of the poems by particular authors because I felt that it wasn't accurate. And so I ended up redoing it for my class because most of the class couldn't read the original. So it's a little complicated. It depends on the writer and the translator.
Right. What made you choose Jewish studies as your area of interest?
Well, that's a big question because it wasn't something that I would have expected or anticipated prior to going to university. It was a new interest of mine. I really was involved in the arts prior to going to university. I was involved in theater and music, and I really was not even following an academic path. And I really was thinking that that was my direction in life. But yet I was always very academically oriented. I just didn't really have a particular focus or interest in any one area. And I think I was very influenced by some of the books that I read. I discovered the work of Agnon quite unexpectedly. And I was so entranced by his work that I felt that there was something in Hebrew literature. I was always a big reader and I read a lot of world literature. But when I discovered the work of Shmuel Yosef Agnon, it was as if something was sparked in me. I felt that there was something so profound and so beautiful in modern Hebrew literature that was lacking in other literature that really spoke to me. I also discovered Jewish philosophy at the same time. I started reading Martin Buber, Emil Fackenheim, some of the modern Jewish thinkers, and they also influenced me. So once I went to university, one of the first professors I studied with was Emil Fackenheim. He was studying, he was teaching at U of T at the time. I went and studied with him, and that really set me on a particular course.
Right. What inspired and drove you to write your first novel? And was it an outgrowth of short stories or poems that you'd written before?
It wasn't really an outgrowth. No, the novel preceded, it's a funny thing. I started writing this novel many years ago, and I put it in a drawer and left it, and then kept coming back to it and writing a bit more, and then putting it away, coming back and writing a bit more. It took a long time until I felt ready to pursue it on a full-time basis. It was really when I took a break from teaching that I was able to finish the novel. But it wasn't an outgrowth. No, it was, I think what it was is that I always had these very strong artistic inclinations. And here I was teaching literature. And I felt that I wanted to be writing the literature, not just teaching it. So here I was going into class with my students, and I loved it. It was great. I always had these very intense seminars with students at U of T, and I really did enjoy it. But at the same time, there was something missing. I felt as though I would like to be creating some of this material myself, not just teaching it, not just analyzing it, but creating it myself. So that's when I started writing the novel. But yet it's such an all-encompassing, absorbing experience that I didn't really have time to do both teaching and writing. So it really wasn't until I took time off from teaching that I was able to pour myself into it.
Right. So my next question was, how long did it take you to write the book? And you partially answered it, but you didn't really put a number of years on it.
I can't even count the years. I mean, once I dedicated myself to it full time, I would say it probably took me a year, but it's already partly written. And then I rewrote it about 3 times.
I see.
It's a very long story because I don't know if anyone here and who's listening is a writer, but when you go from being a writer to wanting to be a published writer, it's an entirely new process. You pretty well need to have an agent, which is very difficult. It's very difficult to get an agent. And then the agent has to be able to sell your work to a publisher, which is another hurdle. You have to jump through all these hoops. Right. And I was a bit naive. I didn't realize how hard it would be. So I got an agent. I did get one. I got a New York agent. She tried to sell my novel. She couldn't sell it. But from the feedback we got, I realized it needed to be rewritten. It wasn't really structured well enough. So this happened a few times, and then I ended up restructuring it and getting it to the point where it was ready. And that's what happened
Very good.
until it's
Are
over.
there any writers in particular who have influenced your writing?
I don't know. I read pretty widely. I mean, I guess Agnon in a way influenced me, but yet I can't draw a direct line between my work and his because it's very different. Some of the Yiddish writers, like Besheva Singer, his brother Israel Joshua Singer, Moshe Kulbach, there were certain writers that I really enjoyed reading. Some of the American writers like Cynthia Ozick, Saul Bellow. But then I love English writers like Dickens and Jane Austen, and Russian writers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy.
Right. So it's a mix.
I read a lot of different types of writing. So I don't know. All I can think of is I wrote the book that I wanted to read. I think that was it. I wanted to create something that I felt needed to be said.
Right.
I don't know if anyone else would feel that way when they read it, but that's how I felt when I was writing it.
Tell us about your writing process. Where do you write? Do you write every day? And what is your writing schedule?
Okay, it's very erratic, for one thing. Sometimes when I'm very involved in writing a section of my work, I can be writing almost all day. But when I'm stuck, when I find that I'm writing a chapter that isn't going well, I can put it aside and leave it for a few weeks because sometimes I just need to do that. So as I said, it's erratic. I write in my office most of the time, which is in my basement. I have a basement office, but during COVID, I ended up changing my habits. I'm right now in my living room, dining room, and I actually have started writing here because I find I love having the natural light. In the basement, I have a window, but there's not that much light down there. And I find I really need the natural light. I think it's because we're so locked in.
Right.
And, I mean, now, of course, the weather's getting better. We can go out much more frequently, but, you know, especially in the winter, I felt I had to be upstairs near my big patio door where there's lots of light coming in, and I like to write up here.
Right.
So that's what I do.
Okay. The settings of the book are Canada, Hungary, and Israel, with the narrative.
And London, England.
Oh, London, England. I forgot about that one.
Yeah.
With the narrative alternating between two young protagonists and unfolding through their coming of age and into adulthood. Susie in Toronto and Arthur in Hungary and Israel. And I guess London, England?
That's right.
I forgot. Sorry. My apologies.
That's okay.
Did you draw on your own experiences of growing up in Toronto in the 60s when you created the character of Susie and her storyline?
Yeah, everyone asked me that. And I understand why they would ask me that because, you know, we're kind of similar in age. She's a little older than I am. I mean, if you trace back when she was probably born, she's a little older than me, but, you know, there's a similarity in age. But yet her story is not mine. You know, a lot of people think it must be mine because it's, you know, set in Toronto and some, I guess, it's flattering that people think that that was what happened to me in a way because that it's so convincing that they think, oh, this must be your story. Well, actually, it isn't. There was no Finn in my life. That's her romance. You know, but yet there are some things in the novel that did happen to me.
Okay.
A few just small incidents in the novel that actually are my experiences. In fact, I tell people this because it's probably something that no one would ever expect. And it doesn't give away anything because I assume most people have not read it who are here. So it doesn't give away anything in the plot, but there's a point in the novel where Arthur Mandelkorn is on a bus in Israel. And there's a man carrying a big bird cage. And he won't let anyone through. And the
right, I remember that part.
bus driver starts yelling at him to move
It
back.
Sounded typical of Israel when you wrote it. So
If been in Israel,
I'm not surprised that it really happened.
Well, it wasn't the exact same thing, but it was a similar thing. I was getting on a bus in Israel. First time I was there, I was probably 20 years old. And as it is in Israel, when you get on the buses, everyone's pushing and shoving. And there was a woman there who didn't have a bird cage like in my book, but she threw a purse over everyone's head and it landed in a seat on the bus. And then she put almost like threw herself into the seat before anyone else could get there. That really happened.
That's good.
That really happened. But I didn't want to use the exact experience in my book. I changed it. But what really did happen is everyone started yelling at her, as it happened in my story.
Right.
Everyone started yelling at her. And then as I wrote in my story, someone screamed, "Shut up. She has a number on her arm. Stop."
Oh, right.
Stop it.
Right.
She has a number on. And then the whole bus was silent.
Really?
And then people started yelling, "You should be ashamed of yourself." I mean, that really happened. So
Interesting.
a variation. I took that experience,
Right.
and I just changed it because that was such an interesting experience in Israel, and it just
Absolutely.
spoke to me.
Are there elements of your own family history in the book? And why is the book partially set in Hungary?
Okay, no, there really are no elements of my family history. I do have some Holocaust survivors in my family, but they're distant relatives, not anyone
Right.
closely related to me. It's not my grandparents, or maybe one great uncle,
Right.
but really not anyone close. But the reason I chose Hungary, well, it was very strategic. I actually chose it for a very particular reason, and that is I did not want to write a Holocaust novel. I don't consider this a Holocaust novel. It's a post-Holocaust novel. I didn't feel that it was really something that I wanted to try to do, to try to capture the experience of what people went through in the camps, for example. I touch on it, but very, very briefly in the book. I wanted to write about the post-Holocaust experience of trauma and how it works itself out in various people's lives and in several generations. And it comes out in these unusual ways. That's what I wanted to do. So the reason I chose Hungary is because Hungary was invaded by the Nazis so late in the war. It was really not until 1944. So it was convenient in a way to have it set in Hungary because I wouldn't have to deal with years of invasion. It really was, it allowed me to get through the war and past the war very quickly.
Right.
So that's why I chose Hungary. And then there was another reason, and that is I knew a lot of Hungarians. There were a lot of Hungarians around when I was growing up. My parents' next door neighbor was Hungarian, and I just seemed to have met a lot of Hungarians, and I found them quite interesting. Partly because their experience is a little bit different than what I grew up with. I grew up with Russian and Polish Jews. Their experience was a little bit different.
Yes. Did you visit Hungary for research?
No, I didn't. No.
Wow.
I didn't. But yet I did talk to a lot of people. I researched quite a bit, but I actually didn't go to Hungary. I'm curious, but I haven't.
You'll have to go now, I'm sure.
Oh, I know.
These days.
I know.
I'd love to go there too. Sharon will now do a reading of an excerpt of the book for us. Sharon, would you like to set that up?
Okay.
And
sure.
take it away.
Yeah, it'll be quite brief because I know most people don't really like listening to long drawn out readings, but I thought what I would do is to give people a taste of the novel, and that is to begin on chapter 2, which is the beginning of Arthur Mandelkorn's story. And Arthur Mandelkorn is he's very young, he's just a young teenager, and he's still in Hungary, and this is when his family is forced to flee. And what happens to them at the very beginning of this terrible experience. So it begins in May 1944. And he begins, and it's told in first person. I was only 14 when the Germans came to our town and started rounding up the Jews. It is hard to describe the terror it caused. Mama's ruddy cheeks turned ashen when she heard that all the Jews in a nearby village had been taken away. When I asked her about it, she clutched the sides of her head and cried, "The world has gone mad, Arthur. I never thought it could happen here." We lived in a German-speaking area not far from the city of Szombathely. Our town was just inside the Hungarian border with Austria, so we had been spared until 1944. But we knew about the atrocities being committed elsewhere. Such things could not be concealed for long. When they came to our town, we knew that this was the end for us. My parents had a friend, an elderly Hungarian bachelor who made clocks for a living and had taught Papa to mend pocket watches as a boy. He agreed to hide all 6 of us, my parents, my 3 siblings, and me, in his cellar. As I lay on the cold mud floor, I could hear the sound of his clocks ticking at different intervals all night long. It was horrible, like fate ticking inside my ears. However, when the clockmaker's sister found out that he was hiding us, they had a terrible row and she threatened to inform the Germans, which meant we were forced to leave at nightfall the next day. But I refused to go into hiding again. I was sure that I'd be trapped, that I would never get out, that I'd never get that ticking clock out of my brain. My sister Manya said she knew of an abandoned house with a broken chimney, close to some farms. She and her friends called it the sunken ship, imagining that it looked like an old pirate ship moored in the fields. Manya and I tried to convince Mama and Papa that hiding there was our best hope. From there, we argued, we could head eastward away from the German offensive. I couldn't tell what Mama was thinking. Her eyes started blinking rapidly, and she shook her head from side to side like a madwoman. Lurching forward, she clutched us by the shoulders and whispered in Yiddish, "You go, children, run, get away, as far as you can go, but you must escape without us. My lungs are weak and Papa's feet are bad, and we have a baby to tend to. We would only slow you down. You must run." But my older brother Carl tried to talk us out of it, arguing that it was better to stay near the town, where there was a chance that someone would hide us. At least then we would be assured of food. With his practical turn of mind, he was sure that we would starve if we had to provide, if no one was to provide for us. Carl was like an old man in that way. He was only 11 months older than me, but his thinking was old. In the end, Manya and I agreed to go off together, though I was only a boy of 14, and she was 2 years younger. Carl insisted on staying with my parents and my baby sister Kati. They planned to seek shelter with a family they knew who owned a small goat farm not far from town. When we said our hasty goodbyes, Mama's face was blotched and streaked with tears, while Papa tightened his lips in an effort to seem brave. Departing from them quickly, I tried to ignore the thick lump forming in my throat. After all, we promised that we'd see each other soon, perhaps in a few weeks, when all of this madness would surely have passed.
Thank you. When I was in Poland 2 years ago, I witnessed the rebirth of Jewish culture and interest in Jewish history that's exploded over the last decade. At the same time, I learned that any information about Jewish experience had been completely suppressed under communism until the late 80s. I attended Krakow's Jewish Cultural Festival, where there were thousands of visitors. We visited JCCs in Warsaw and Krakow, synagogues, Jewish schools, beautiful, well-maintained cemeteries, and of course, the Polin Museum. And I learned that part of this incredible rebirth is due to Poles who had rediscovered their own Jewish roots. Without getting too specific, for people that haven't read the book yet, did this idea play a part in the creation of one of the storylines in the book?
Okay. I can understand why you're asking that, because there are several characters in the book who are struggling to understand who they are, and they're they have various levels of identification with what it means to be a Jew. In particular, there's one, and I'm not going to give away too much, who doesn't even know he's Jewish. And this whole idea of concealment and shame in one's own identity plays a big role in the novel on several levels, so that even the theme of the book or the title of the book, Come Back For Me, resonates on various planes. So it's not just about coming back for his sister, which is something that Arthur is obsessed with all throughout the novel, and she asks him to come back for her. But it's coming back as in returning to who one really is. And that requires a great deal of effort and a great deal of honesty. And it works on various levels in the book.
Right. The concepts of family, identity, and place are important ideas in the book. The characters are searching for a feeling of belonging and rootedness, which you just said that. These concepts resonate with me, even though I'm a second-generation Canadian and it's been 75 years since the Holocaust. Why do you suppose that is? That it resonates with us so generations after the Holocaust?
I think because it is an unprecedented event. And this is something I learned from Emil Fackenheim, the philosopher, that it's very difficult to even grasp how devastating an event it was. Every time historians try to describe it, try to account for it, try to understand how it could have happened, they usually hit a brick wall. I mean, there are theories, is it economic reasons? Was it greed that, the Germans wanted to steal from the Jews? Or there was anti-Semitism based on, the history of Jews and the relationship with Christianity. I mean, there's so many theories that have been brought forward, but really no one is able to fully understand it because the degree of evil, that's the only word I can use, that really transpired is something almost beyond our imagination, because it wasn't just, it's terrible enough that there was an attempt to kill every Jew in Europe, but there was the element of torture that was part of that killing, that it wasn't even enough to kill them, but there was humiliation and torture involved. So in that way, I think it's very hard for most people to understand how it could have happened, why it happened. And it's something that's very, very difficult to just dismiss and say, well, we're past that. Oh yeah, it happened. To some extent, I think there's a lingering amount of trauma that is transferred through the generations, that if you're raised with that memory in your family, it affects the way children are raised, the way they're overprotected, perhaps, the way they're raised to fear other people. There are all kinds of manifestations psychologically. They even now think that people's brains are affected by trauma, that there is a transgenerational change in the brain formation that can be traced through these brain scans. That's a whole new element of science, but I think even if you don't look at it scientifically, it makes a lot of sense that when a people has gone through this sort of inexplicable experience, you can't just bury it. You can't just say, well, it happened then and it'll never happen again. I think the point that Emil Fackenheim makes is it happened once. And unfortunately, when something happened once, it's a precedent.
Right. The idea of generational trauma appears, as we just discussed, and of secrecy. It takes many years for Susie to uncover the story of her aunt and uncle. Yes. This rings true for me as well. I had relatives, not my immediate family, but great aunts and uncles, second and third cousins, who survived the Holocaust, but I never learned the details of their stories and the fate of many relatives who disappeared until fairly recently.
Yes.
That's why your book is so important. It brings these stories to life. Do you think that Holocaust fiction and nonfiction and survivors' testimonies can raise awareness of contemporary anti-Semitism?
Well, good question. I think it can, yes, because I think what stories do, as opposed to just reading history, which is important too, and I think reading history is necessary. But sometimes not everyone can read history. Some people find reading history too dry and too remote. Reading stories personalizes history, and it takes the reader on a kind of journey that they can feel rather than just think about. So it draws people in a completely on a different level. So I think it can. I think it sensitizes people to what it was like and what it would be like to be a Jew at that time.
Right. The book has several romantic storylines, but to me, the love between Arthur and his sister Manya is the most poignant relationship of all. What inspired you to write about a brother and a sister in this way?
Oh, I don't know if anyone's ever asked me that question. I've done a lot of interviews and talks. You know, I don't have a younger sister. I do have an older brother, but I guess it's such an elemental relationship. And it was a very protective relationship that he had with Manya because they escaped together. And the fact that she depended on him so completely and she was so vulnerable, it allowed him to, or allowed me as a writer to create a character who felt that he couldn't just think about himself, that he had a responsibility to another person. And this in a way created great guilt, but it also sustained him. So it was a double-edged sword. You know, he suffered from the guilt, but yet he survived partly because he promised that he would find her. So
Right.
it had those two elements to it.
The book follows Susie as she grows from a teenager to a young woman. She goes through periods of rebellion where she's trying to find independence, and part of this is her love life and search for identity. Do you think that the hidden trauma in her family made this quest for independence more difficult? I think you mentioned something about this before as well.
Yes, I think there is a direct connection between the lack of open communication in her family, hiding things from her, keeping her, trying to shelter her from difficult truths, creates this distrust in her, that she doesn't feel that her parents are completely honest with her, and she doesn't feel she really belongs there. She's not treated like an adult, and she feels that she's grown up enough to be treated like an adult. So she ends up rebelling, and that's part of why she gets involved with someone who's really bad for her, who's not someone who can give her what she really needs. And
Right.
that's why she has to learn, though. She fools
Yeah.
herself all the way through. She fools herself about who he is. But
Right.
he's quite honest about who he is. She just doesn't want to see it.
Right. The bigger question is, as a community, does our collective trauma color our search for a place in society in the diaspora, as well as Israel's place in the family of nations?
Yes, well, that is a huge question. I think it can't help but color it. That the fact that we have experienced something so devastating in our recent history, it really isn't that long ago, makes us feel extremely vulnerable, even though our situation has changed. There's now a Jewish state. But at the same time, that state is always being threatened. So yes, I think the fact that we experienced that devastating attempt to destroy every Jew in Europe, and if Hitler had his way, he would have wanted to destroy every Jew on the planet. How can it not? How can it not color the way Jews think of themselves in the world, if they're honest with themselves, if they really think about it. And a lot of people don't want to think about it.
Right. There seems today to be an attempt to distort Holocaust history. For example, the right-wing government of Poland has enacted laws that say you can't blame war crimes from that period on Poles.
Yes.
This happened as a response to historians like Jan Gross and Jan Grabowski, who uncovered facts about Polish participation in these crimes. Do you think Holocaust education and literature can help to counter this distortion of history?
Yes, as long as people are able to write freely, I think it can counter it. Now, how much that will filter down to those who read in other languages, I don't know how restrictive, for example, the publishing of literature is in Poland. But at least here, right now, we still have a certain amount of freedom, although there's a lot of censorship happening right now, so it's a little hard to say. But as long as we still have the freedom to write about what we want and what we believe is true, then and people have the freedom to search for the truth, then I think yes, I think literature can contribute a great deal to that. That it's not the only tool, but it's a very powerful vehicle. That's
Right.
why, when Solzhenitsyn wrote during, in the Gulag,
Mm-hmm.
it made a huge impression when his works were smuggled out. And the same was true of Czech writers whose work was smuggled out.
Mm.
It helped eventually, I think, bring down those regimes. So literature can be very powerful.
Right. Jewish fiction, like Judaism itself, balances a particular cultural experience with the universal human experience. Do you think that this tension is what gives Jewish fiction its power?
Well, I think the best of Jewish fiction, yes. I mean, not every work of Jewish fiction is universal. And sometimes it's surprising to learn which works do appeal to the broader nations. There are people of different countries. For example, Sholem Aleichem's work, which is so particular in many ways, with all of its uniqueness about Yiddish culture, Eastern European Jewish culture. His work is loved all throughout the world, in places like Japan and Korea. They read Sholem Aleichem, and it surprises people in a way, because you think, well, how could they relate to Jews in the shtetl? What would it say to them? But yet he somehow manages to talk about the universal from within the particular. And that takes a great deal of skill in a writer. And it's always difficult to predict which writers not only will speak to people beyond their own audience, but also which writers will last. So it's almost unfathomable. It's almost difficult to predict.
Right.
But somehow, Sholem Aleichem is one of those writers who managed to transcend the particularity.
Right. One element in the book is tradition and Jewish ritual.
Yes.
Synagogues, which serve as meeting places, especially for Archer, who he feels conflicted and seems to move away from or back towards tradition. Do you think that even for secular Jewish stories, prayers, tradition, and scripture are always somewhere in the background, the source of our culture, even when they're absent?
Yes, I actually do. And I brought that into the novel in a fairly subtle way, I think. I didn't want it to be a novel that, is trying to be preachy in any way about religion. That religion is such a personal thing for most people. And I didn't want to be saying that religion is the answer for everyone. But at the same time, Arthur, who came from a traditional background, moved away from it, still felt this longing for something that he lost. And that's where that comes in later in the novel, where there's something missing when there's no tradition in his life. So I don't want to say more because I don't want to give away the plot, but
Right.
yes, it's as if it was still, there was an echo there of tradition that still spoke to him. And he didn't want to give that up. He felt that he'd be losing something.
Right. There's an object in the book that plays a key role throughout, tying things together, not a ritual object, but a toy musical instrument. How important is music in your writing and in Jewish literature?
Well, music has always been really important to me personally. Um, we sing a lot in my family. Um, uh, Around the Shabbat table, in general, all three of my sons are singers, and
Wow.
my youngest is a chazan on the side.
Wow.
On the
I
side.
didn't even know that. I didn't even know that. I had no
Yeah,
clue.
yeah, he is. He does it as a sideline.
That's wonderful.
Yes, and so music has always been a very big part of my life and my family life. My mother was someone who sang all the time too.
Really?
So yes, it was something that was in my home. Um, but yet I didn't intentionally insert it into the novel. It just seemed to happen. Partly because Manya was musically gifted, and I that was one of her very remarkable traits, is that she had this voice that was almost more mature than her age. And so the fact that she loved this little instrument was a way for Arthur to cherish her memory and to allow him to keep searching for her. It was more than just an instrument, though. It was something, it was the last thing he had of hers.
Right. Judy Battalion just came out with her nonfiction account of the stories of women underground fighters in the ghettos,
Yes.
The Light of Days. Your book includes women's stories and a woman's perspective as well. Susie ultimately finds her voice and her identity. Do you think women's stories have been suppressed in the past, but maybe now are having somewhat of a moment?
Um, I don't think they've been consciously suppressed. I think that, you know, women's stories were always there and were always very important. It's just that people are noticing more. I don't think there was any kind of conspiracy to keep women down or anything of that sort. I think women have always, if they're people of talent, have always risen and have expressed themselves. But now people are more interested. Partly it's the times, and so we see
Okay.
more, and scholar, and certainly those in the scholarly world are particularly interested, to the extent that maybe they're excluding other things. But I won't go into that any further.
There is much discussion of Zionism in the book and the idea of Israel as a refuge for Archer and other Holocaust survivors who had no homes in Europe to return to.
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of general understanding nowadays of the importance of Israel as a national home, that the idea of a Jewish state as a safe haven for Jews is being lost or distorted?
Well, yes, indeed. Absolutely. I think that there's an attempt to make people embarrassed to say that they are a Zionist, that the word Zionist used to be a term of pride. And now on campuses and even in high schools, students have to, unfortunately, feel obliged to hide the fact that they're pro-Israel, or feel they're on the defensive. So yes, I think that there is a sense in which Zionism has become it's really something that we have to revive as something that's a positive. There has to be almost like a counter revolution where Zionism is reinvigorated. Not just as a refuge, though. I think that it is a refuge, but it's also a place of great creativity, and a place where Jews can be completely themselves. And I think that was part of what
Yes.
I'm trying to do in the novel, is that it wasn't just a place to run away to and hide. It was a place where you can be completely natural
Yes.
as a Jew and not have to worry about it, not have to be defensive, and not have to
Right.
apologize to anyone.
Absolutely. Much of the book takes place in Israel, Have you spent a lot of time there, and have you lived on a kibbutz?
Um, I have spent quite a bit of time, not years on end, but I've visited many, many times. I have very close friends there. Now one of my kids lives there. And I don't, I never actually worked on a kibbutz, but I have some relatives on a kibbutz, distant relatives and I visited them a number of times. So I never did the whole volunteer on a kibbutz thing. My husband did when he was a teenager, but I never did. But you know, I'm quite familiar with kibbutz life, and I know the country quite well. But I haven't visited it from corner to corner. There are still places I've never been to in Israel that I want to see. So I find it endlessly fascinating.
Did you travel there for research for this book?
No, I didn't. No, although while I was writing it, I was there for, I did happen to go there. I think I was at a conference or something during the period when I was writing it.
Right. I learned this week at a program about the history of Beth Shalom's spectacular stained glass windows that our shul is one of the few in North America that actually depicts Theodore Herzl, David Ben-Gurion, and Chaim Weizmann, the fathers of Zionism, in the windows, and very good likenesses too. And I have to say, I'm very proud of the shul's display of its deep connection to Israel. There's a part in the book where we find Zionist versus anti-Zionist Jews in the DP camp before the establishment of the State of Israel. But now, 73 years later, Israel is a strong, diverse, thriving, free democracy. Do you think anti-Zionism today can be a form of anti-Semitism?
I actually do. I know that there's a big debate about that going on now. You know, about adopting the resolution of that's being
the IRA definition.
Yes, yes. But yet I do side with those who say that anti-Zionism is often a form of anti-Semitism. I don't say it's always, but I think it often is. I think it's morphed. It's basically morphed into anti-Zionism. It's a way, it's a respectable way
Yes.
of liking Jews.
Right. Have you experienced any feedback about your depiction of Israel or Zionism in the book?
No, I mean, I haven't gotten any negative feedback, luckily. I've gotten a lot, well, I've gotten feedback, but only positive.
Good.
I haven't had anyone trying to cancel me or censor me. Thank goodness, not so far.
Good. Your book highlights the connection and shared roots of Jews in Toronto, Hungary, Israel, and England.
Yes.
Do you think that by exploring our own family histories, studying Jewish literature, and visiting Israel, each one of us can get a better understanding of our own identity?
Absolutely. I think that all of these things allow us to come closer to understand who we are, that education and knowledge are acquired not just through reading history books, that education and knowledge comes from reading, from traveling, to interacting with others from whom we can learn. So yes, it's a multifaceted process. And learning the language, I think, is very important. Learning
Absolutely.
Hebrew, learning to speak Hebrew. And when you go to Israel, to try to speak with people in the language. It's hard, but it's something that is extremely satisfying.
Tell us about your next project. I know you said you're working on another novel and you're almost done. What is it about? When will it be published? Tell us a little bit about that project.
Okay. Well, it isn't a dual narrative, and like Come Back From Me. This is a single narrative. It's a coming of age story about a young man who is trying to escape the turmoil of a very difficult past and a difficult family. And he is trying to escape and establish who he is apart from his family, and he is someone with a great gift. He's a gifted poet. and he's trying to find his way in the world and to find love as well by somehow balancing being a poet and yet trying to come to terms with his own Jewish identity.
Very good. Looking forward to reading that one too.
I don't have a title yet. I usually don't have titles until I'm finished, and I'm still not quite finished. And I'm not even thinking about who's going to publish it. I haven't given it to my agent yet. She hasn't tried to sell it yet. You really can't sell a novel till it's completely done. So still have a little ways to go.
Okay. The cover of your book is so striking. I assume it depicts Manya, the
Yes.
sister of Archer, but it also looks like bricks or tiles, bombs or airplanes. I wasn't sure.
Yes.
And maybe even a map. I don't know if I imagined that or if I actually saw a map. Can you tell us how it was designed, like the process, how you came up with it?
Well, I actually didn't design it myself. It was my publisher. You know, the publisher is the New Jewish Press. And the New Jewish Press was founded by Malcolm Lester, who was a very well-known publisher in Canada. And he always had this dream of starting a Jewish press. And my book was the first work of fiction that they published. And I don't think they've ever published another one after it, because unfortunately, they published about 5 or 6 books. Mine was the only fiction. And unfortunately, Malcolm Lester became ill. And he really couldn't handle running a publishing house. So U of T Press ended up buying it. And now the New Jewish Press is part of U of T Press. So when this book came out, it was still part of the original publisher, and they had their own cover designer. He read the book and came up with this cover. I really didn't have any input. And I thought it was really very striking too.
It's beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, it had a lot. There is a lot to it if you look at it carefully. You're right. Yeah. There is an aerial map.
Oh, there is. Okay.
Yes, you're right. There is a kind of aerial map which depicts, I think, Europe. And it's almost like an aerial map with a bomber going over.
Are these airplanes or bombs? Like I couldn't tell.
You know, it's hard to say.
Either one.
I would say they're bombers probably, and that this is a picture of the sister.
Right.
Some people ask me, is that a boy or a girl?
It's
a girl.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think my eyelashes are too long to be a boy.
That's right.
To me, that is Manya.
Yes. Absolutely.
Even though I didn't design it, to me, that's what it says.
Yes. So please tell our viewers tonight where they can purchase the book in case they haven't done so already and would like to buy a copy.
Okay, the book is available quite broadly. It can be bought at bookstores, although most bookstores are closed right now. So if you want to order a copy, it can be bought purchased at Amazon, or Chapters Indigo in the States at Barnes & Noble. It's really available throughout the world on these various websites and in actual brick and mortar stores when they're open. So, I mean, you can also order it directly through U of T Press sometimes people order, if they're ordering it for a classroom or for a study group or a book club, you can order it in quantity through the press. Sometimes they'll give you a discount.
Okay, good to know. I have a few additional questions. One from the audience is, Alan asks, did you find it easier or harder to write during the pandemic? I know you talked about the light, but other than that, was it easier, harder, the same to write during the pandemic?
It gave me more time. I didn't have as many distractions. So right. I would say in some ways it did provide me with more time. But on the other hand, I would have liked to have had no pandemic and have not had to write. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't, some people did find it hard to write. I know other friends who are writers found it difficult. I didn't really, no, I didn't find the pandemic affected me in that way.
Okay. Some writers say that the characters themselves take a life of their own and drive the story forward. Did this happen to you?
Yes. Absolutely. People often ask me, did you plan out the characters, and did you know what's going to happen to them, and was it all planned out before, or did they take on a life of their own? And really, they did take on a life of their own. I really didn't know what would happen to most of them. I had a vague idea how the book was going to end, but I didn't know how I was going to get there. And that's how I write. And I'm doing the same with my new novel. I don't really know how I'm getting to that end, although I know basically how it will end. So yes, I feel as if I know those characters. They're very real to me.
And do you miss those characters?
I do. Yes, I do miss them. And in fact, several people have asked me if I'm tempted to write a sequel.
Right.
And it is tempting. I haven't taken it that seriously in that I haven't planned one, but I could see it happening maybe in the future.
Great. So I think our time is up, and I'd like to thank Sharon for joining us this evening at our author's night at Beth Shalom. And thank you to all our guests who joined us. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night. Thanks for coming.